Welcome to this video. We are law students who created this video in partial fulfillment of our requirements in legal technique and logic. Note that we are not experts in this field and therefore majority if not all of the materials included in this video were taken from the internet, which were published by more credible people than we are. Yes, this video will be simple, but will surely be informative. Without further ado, let's get into this video. The main objective of this video is to understand the basic concepts in logic. But in order to do so, let's do a quick review on the definition of logic, the aim of logic, and the benefit that we can get from the study of logic. So logic is defined as an organized body of knowledge or science that evaluates arguments. The term argument will be defined later on in the discussion. Aim of logic, on the other hand, is to develop a system of methods and principles that we may use as a criteria for evaluating the arguments of others and as guides in contrasting arguments of our own. So, what is the benefit from the study of logic? It is beneficial to us that we may increase in confidence that we are making sense when we criticize the arguments of others and when we advance arguments of our own. After that quick review on logic, let me give you a rundown on what to expect in this video. You can expect to learn the definition of argument, the parts of argument such as premise and conclusion, the example of arguments, as well as the typical kinds of non-arguments. But the most important thing in this video is the making of healthy and effective argument. What is an argument? Argument is a concrete expression of logical reasoning. Argument consists of group of statements, one or more of which are claimed to provide support for or reasons to believe one of the others. There is a need for us to define statements since argument is defined as group of statements. Statement, by definition, is a sentence that is either true or false, or in other words, typically a declarative sentence or a sentence component that could stand as a declarative sentence. Examples: no wives ever cheat on their husbands. Chocolate truffles are loaded with calories. Unlike statements which can either be true or false, many sentences cannot be said to be one, like question, proposal, suggestion, command, and exclamation. Statements that make up an argument are divided into one or more premises and only one conclusion. So in simple terms, we can say that the following will be the parts of an argument, namely premises and conclusion. Premises is defined as statements that set forth the reasons or evidence, whereas conclusion is a statement that the evidence is claimed to support or imply. Example: all film stars are celebrities. Premise: Halle Berry is a film star. Second premise: therefore, Halle Berry is a celebrity. Conclusion. Typical conclusion indicators are the words therefore, wherefore, thus, consequently, accordingly, hence, as a result. On the other hand, typical premise indicators are because, for, as indicated by, seeing that, as, given that, since. Argument can be classified as good argument and bad argument. Good argument is when premises really do support the conclusion, while bad argument is when premises claim to support the conclusion but actually do not. Related to the concepts of argument and statement are those of inference and proposition. Inference can be used interchangeably with argument. It is reasoning process expressed by an argument. while proposition can be used interchangeably with statement, meaning or information content of a statement. We must note that not all passages contain arguments. So how do we recognize arguments? A passage contains an argument if it purports to prove something. A passage purports to prove something if at least one of the statements must claim to present evidence or reasons, which can be simply called factual claim, or the second one, if there must be a claim that the alleged evidence supports or implies something, that is, a claim that something follows from the alleged evidence or reasons, which can be simply called inferential claim. To clarify, factual claim is deciding whether it is fulfilled often falls outside the domain of logic. However, inferential claim that the passage expresses a certain kind of reasoning process, that something supports or implies something, or that something follows from something. Objective feature of an argument grounded in its language or structure. Inferential claim can be distinguished into two: explicit and implicit inferential claim. Explicit inferential claim, usually asserted by premise or conclusion indicator words like thus, since, because, hence, therefore, and so on. Example: mad cow disease is spread by feeding parts of infected animals to cows, and this practice has yet to be completely eradicated. Thus, mad cow disease continues to pose a threat to people who eat beef. On the other hand, implicit inferential claim exists if there is an inferential relationship between the statements in a passage, but the passage contains no indicator words. Example: the genetic modification of food is risky business. Genetic engineering can introduce unintended changes into the DNA of the food product organism, and these changes can be toxic to the consumer. The main difference between explicit and implicit inferential claim is the presence of premise or conclusion indicator words. Whether there is a claim that evidence supports or implies something, we need to keep an eye for, number one, indicator words, and the second one, the presence of an inferential relationship between statements. Warning: the mere occurrence of an indicator word by no means guarantees the presence of an argument, meaning the presence of an indicator does not necessarily entail that the statement is an argument. The second word of caution is that it is not always easy to detect the occurrence of an inferential relationship between the statements in a passage, and one may have to review a passage several times before making a decision. To assist in distinguishing passages that contain arguments from those that do not, let us now investigate some typical kinds of non-arguments. Remember, the following will be kinds of non-arguments. We will be discussing simple non-inferential passages, expository passages, illustrations, explanations, and conditional statements. Simple non-inferential passages are unproblematic passages that lack a claim that anything is being proved. It contains statements that could be premises or conclusions or both, but what is missing, remember this part, is a claim that any potential premise support a conclusion or that any potential conclusion is supported by premises. Simple non-inferential passages can be in 5 forms. The first one, warning. Form of expression that is intended to put someone on guard against a dangerous or detrimental situation. Example: watch out that you don't sleep on the ice. That's an example of warning. The second form of simple non-inferential passages is piece of advice. Form of expression that makes a recommendation about some future decision or course of conduct. Example: before accepting a job after class hours, I would suggest that you give careful consideration to your course load. Will you have sufficient time to prepare for classes and tests? And will the job produce an excessive drain on your energies? Third form of simple non-inferential passages: statement of belief or opinion. An expression about what someone happens to believe or think about something. Example: we believe that our company must develop and produce outstanding products that will perform a great service or fulfill a need for our customers. The fourth form of simple non-inferential passages is loosely associated statements. Maybe about the same general subject, but they lack a claim that one of them is proved by the other. Example: not to honor men of worth will keep the people from contention. Not to value goods that are hard to come by will keep them from theft. Not to display what is desirable will keep them from being unsettled of mind. And the last form of simple non-inferential passages is report. Consists of a group of statements that convey information about some topic or event. Example: even though more of the world is immunized than ever before, many old diseases have proven quite resilient in the face of changing population and environmental conditions, especially in the developing world. Once again, simple non-inferential passages consist or may be presented in 5 different forms: in a form of warning, a piece of advice, statement of belief or opinion, loosely associated statements, or report. And just to reiterate a point, simple non-inferential passages contain of statements that could be premises or conclusions or both, but what is missing is a claim that any potential premise support a conclusion or that any potential conclusion is supported by premises. The second kind of typical non-arguments is expository passages. Kind of discourse that begins with a topic sentence followed by one or more sentences that develop the topic sentence. Remember, if the objective is not to prove the topic sentence but only to expand it or elaborate it, then there is no argument. Example: there are 3 familiar states of matter: solid, liquid, and gas. Solid objects ordinarily maintains their shape and volume regardless of their location. A liquid occupies a definite volume but assumes the shape of the occupied portion of its container. A gas maintains neither shape nor volume. It expands to fill completely whatever container it is in. So, we can recognize that the second sentences onward are just mere elaboration or explanation on the 3 states of matter, and therefore can be considered expository passages. The third typical kind of non-arguments is illustrations, an expression involving one or more examples that is intended to show what something means or how it is done. It is often confused with arguments because many illustrations contain indicator words such as thus. Example: a deciduous tree is any tree that loses its leaves during the winter. For example, maples are deciduous and so are elms, poplars, hawthorns, and alders. However, let us not be confused that many illustrations can be taken as arguments, and such arguments are called arguments from example. Example: although most forms of cancer, if untreated, can cause death, not all cancers are life-threatening. For example, basal cell carcinoma, the most common of all skin cancers, can produce disfigurement, but it almost never results in death. The next typical kind of non-arguments is explanations. Expression that purports to shed light on some event or phenomenon. The event or phenomenon in question is usually accepted as a matter of fact. Example: the sky appears blue from the Earth's surface because light rays from the sun are scattered by particles in the atmosphere. It is mistaken for arguments because it contains the indicator word because.
There are two distinct components of an explanation: explanandum and explainants. Explanandum is a statement that describes the event or phenomenon to be explained, while explainants is a statement or group of statements that purports to do the explaining. Conditional statements are statements that use an if and then in a statement. For example, if Lance Armstrong has won the Tour de France 7 consecutive times, then he ranks as king of the hill in the world's most famous bicycle race. There are two components that made up every conditional statement, which is an antecedent and a consequent. Antecedent is a component statement immediately following the if. In the example earlier, where Lance Armstrong has won the Tour de France 7 consecutive times, serves as the antecedent. And the consequent, as a component statement, is following the then. The consequent of the example earlier is when he ranks as king of the hill in the world's most famous bicycle race. But what is the relationship between conditional statements and arguments? The relation between conditional statements and arguments is: first, a single conditional statement is not an argument. Second, a conditional statement may serve as either the premise or the conclusion or both of an argument. And third, the inferential content of a conditional statement may be re-expressed to form an argument. But why are conditional statements important in logic? Conditional statements are especially important in logic because they express the relationship between necessary and sufficient condition. A sufficient condition is when A is said to be a sufficient condition for B whenever the occurrence of A is all that is needed for the occurrence of B. While necessary condition is when B is said to be a necessary condition for A whenever A cannot occur without the occurrence of B. The making of a healthy and effective argument. Founding an argument. Complicated arguments usually result from the large number of premises they contain and from how those premises relate to one another. Therefore, knowing the proper founding of an argument will prevent this from happening. The inferential move. It is an elemental move of reasoning whereby we go from one idea that is known to be true to a second idea that is recognized as true on the force of the first idea. Arguments are composed of statements, and statements are made up of premise and conclusion. The most effective arguments are those that are trying to make a single point. The move from universal to particular. But why should there be a move from universal to particular? The logic behind the move from universal to particular and the necessity it entails is simple enough. If I know something to be true about an entire group, then it must also be true about any portion of the group. But what is a universal statement? Universal statement is when, if it is true, a particular statement with the same subject and predicate is also true. For example, if it is true that a dog is carnivorous, then it is true that some dogs are carnivorous. And the necessary conclusion of this is that one that is not possible to doubt, it is certain. The move from particular to universal. Knowledge of a part does not allow me to say anything definitive about the whole. For example, some women are mothers, but I am not allowed to conclude that every woman is a mother. It is a pretty obvious mistake to claim that something is necessarily true for a whole group because it happens to be true for a part of the group. Predication. The need to know predication and having a sound predication is for us to end up with true statements. Every statement is composed of a subject and a predicate. A subject is that about which something is said. A predicate is what is said. Predication is the idea connecting process by which we attribute something to something else. It's the process of bringing ideas together and coupling them. Test of sound predication is when ideas that are brought together belong together. For example, measles is infectious. Infectious is predicated of measles. This is a sound predication because the subject and the predicate do indeed belong together. Negative statements. Negative statements can sometimes be tricky, and we must be careful when we use them to make sure they are actually saying what we intend them to say. There's an affirmative and negative statement. Affirmative statements connect ideas, while negative statements disconnect ideas. Universal negative statements disconnect ideas completely. For example, no philosophers are infallible, while particular negative statement disconnects ideas incompletely. For example, some North Dakotans do not read Dickens. Making comparisons. The comparison reflected in the statement is foundational, in that it is the source for the whole complex array of other comparisons we make between and among statements which together constitute the content of our thought. Judgment is a mental act by which we link ideas in a way that enables us to make coherent statements about the world in which we live in. Sound judgment is the relationship it forged between two ideas which reflects a real relationship in the objective world. In comparing any two things, especially large, complex things such as historical events, we must be careful not to rush to the judgment that we have a strong comparison because the two events are very much alike, simply because of the large number of similar characteristics we have noted. Comparison and argument. When we bring an argument to bear on comparison, our purpose is to demonstrate that the two we are comparing are in fact similar. The argument by analogy is when of two things I am comparing, one of them, which is A, is better known to you than B. And the analogy is that of the relation of similarity between two things. Sound argument. In order for an argument to be sound, it must be so with respect to its matter or contents and to its form or its structure. There are three forms of argument: conjunctive, disjunctive, and conditional argument. I'll elaborate further the conditional argument in the coming slides. Conjunctive argument is when both A and B are true. This is a package deal. You can't isolate one term and take that as true while regarding the other as false. While disjunctive argument is when they both cannot be true, where if one is true, the other must be false and vice versa. Conditional argument or hypothetical argument. This is the if and then argument. The link between A and B is absolutely necessary. If A comes about, then B must come about. Similar to the example earlier, that if Lance Armstrong has won the Tour de France 7 consecutive times, then he ranks as king of the hill in the world's most famous bicycle race. Syllogistic argument. But what is syllogism? It is a form of argument that reflects the way the human mind habitually operates. That is, connecting ideas in such a way that conclusions can be drawn from those connections. How is syllogism composed? Every M is P. Every S is M. Therefore, every S is P. Syllogistic reasoning is based upon the operation of relating a part to a whole in order to establish clearly something about the part. The truth of premises. Sound argument must have sound contents and a sound form. The contents are sound if the statements serving as the premises of the arguments are true. If we start with a false premise, a valid argument will only allow us to proceed consistently to a false conclusion. A sound form will not rescue an argument if its contents are false. The best of vehicles will not get us to where we want to go without the gas. The relevancy of premises. While the truth of the premises is a necessary condition for sound argument, it is not sufficient condition. True premises may not contribute so much to the argument if they poorly support its conclusion. Statements of facts and statement of value. An argument based upon a statement of value can never have the same kind of conclusiveness as an argument based upon a statement of fact, for evaluations can be contested interminably. But not all statements of value are lacking of soundness. The test of the soundness of a statement of value is the extent to which it is founded upon objective fact. The broader and more solid the foundation of objective fact, the more reliable the statement of value based on it. Argumentative form. It is possible to have an argument whose premises are perfectly true but whose conclusion is false, and this is because the argument's form is defective. Example: every squirrel is a mammal, every chipmunk is a mammal, therefore every chipmunk is a squirrel. The optimal form of an argument is one that, given true premises, will guarantee a necessarily true conclusion. Conclusions must reflect quantity of premises. Quantity of a statement refers to its being either universal or particular, established by the quantity of its subject term. Quantity must be reflected in the conclusion in a more absolute way. That is, the quantity of a term which appears in the conclusion, be the term a subject or predicate, must not exceed the quantity of that same term as it appears in the premises. In other words, if the term is universal in the conclusion, it must be universal in the premises. It is composed as some M are P, some S are M, therefore some S are P. Conclusions must reflect quality of premises. Quality of a statement refers to its being either affirmative or negative. If the statement that serves as the conclusion of an argument is negative, at least one of the premises in the argument must be negative. Inductive argument. There are two argumentative forms, deductive and inductive argument. Deductive argument is from general to particular and the productive of necessary conclusions, while inductive argument is from particular to general, which is the capacity to produce probable conclusions only. Inductive reasoning is ordered to making reliable generalizations, that is, those having a high degree of probability about a large group of things. Assessing argument. What is the importance of assessing argument? We argue well because first we reason well, and the purpose of both arguing and reasoning is to enable us to perform more freely and purposefully in the world. In assessing argument, first, you should ascertain whether or not there is indeed an argument to assess. In other words, are the two basic elements of argument, which is premises and conclusions, present at all? Second, look immediately to the premises that supports its conclusion. And third, determine whether or not the argument is structurally sound. Does it in fact make critical connections between the ideas on which the soundness of its conclusion depends? Constructing an argument. In constructing an argument, first, be mindful of premises and a conclusion. Second, the premises must support the conclusion. Premises must measure up with respect to truth and strength. The truth or premises. Premises must be true. A premise may be substantially true, but not precisely true. And lastly, you should know your audience. While logic is a science, it is also an art. An argument has a dual purpose, which is to produce true conclusions and to persuade audience. To succeed in the latter, present an argument in a way that suits the audience in front of you. That's where the artistry comes in. And this is the end of our presentation regarding understanding basic concepts in logic. Thank you for listening.